Okay, Steve, a really interesting view of a really, I think, very important stage in a lesson. We've had a question come in from Gabby, who actually asks about the rationale behind prediction within the context of the risk that it might be perceived by some as being patronizing. Gabby, I don't know if you wanted to come on to mic and share the question with us. Maybe we can then look at, is it patronizing? And if not, why not? If it can be seen as patronizing, how do we deal with that in the classroom? Because I'm a real fan of prediction myself as well.
Hi, Neil. Hi, Steve. I mean, I don't know, because you see, Neil, you've just said that you are a big fan of predicting, prediction activities. And you see, I, on the other hand, I'm not. And I can tell you, I'm going to tell you why. Because I remember when I was a student, in particular, when I was advanced proficiency level student, I found it really, really odd when teachers were kind of, telling students, that people like me who, and I consider myself a competent reader in L1, so I found it a bit odd and a waste of time that the teacher could be telling me to kind of look at the headlines and the images and all this and how to predict. I just felt like that it was not the place and the time. So, and it kind of, and because of my own experience, I always feel, with prediction activities, I feel, I mean, I like prediction activities, but I wouldn't call this stage teaching prediction. I would call it, I don't know, a speaking task before the reading, or a lead-in, or a warm-up, any other label, but not predicting. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but
Sure.
I just don't like this idea of telling students how to predict, because as you said yourself, Steve, people know in the L1, everybody knows how to predict. We all do it, right?
Yeah.
So it's a good point to remind, as you said, to make people aware that they have to be doing it more consciously in L2. But then perhaps this is something that can only be taught at lower levels. And then when from upper intermediate level, advanced and proficiency, it's just, it may be a bit patronizing, or it may be something completely superfluous, in the sense that it's just not the place, not the time.
I think what I would say is, as teachers, we have to remember all the time that our subject is English, but what we teach is, well, we teach students, and we don't just teach students, we teach individuals. And so the first thing really, whenever we're planning a lesson, is remember your audience. Who are your students? Are they going to appreciate this lesson or not? If you have a very intelligent, well-read group of people, then maybe could be patronizing. And I agree with you to a certain extent that once you're at proficiency level, no, there are other things that we should be doing in the classroom other than this. Low level, I'm not sure, yes, definitely this is a great skill for lower level students. But also this has worked really well for me with B2, B2+, verging on C1 students too. And what I think is actually so much of what we teach students, when we break it down into subskills, so many of those subskills, yeah, it is grandma sucking eggs, isn't it? We're teaching students things that they do subconsciously in their own language, and we're pointing out those things that they do subconsciously in their own language.
Yeah, but some other subskills are perhaps, sorry to interrupt you, but there are subskills that even even though we also do it in L1, like say inferring meaning, I mean, this is very useful in English because it deals with lexis as well. So it's not just teaching inferring meaning, it's dealing with lexis in English as well. So,
yes, Neil.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point you've just made, Gabby. I mean, first of all, coming back to your point about your personal feelings about prediction and the value of prediction, I think Steve's absolutely, hit the nail on the head, making the point about your level. And I think also the fact that you are a language teacher, that, like those of us who actually are on the panel here right now, we're language teachers. We have a facility with language that many of our students never achieve. And therefore, I think it's quite dangerous. And I'm certainly not suggesting this is what you're doing, Gabby, but I think we need to remember, as Steve has said, our students, those individuals, may not have that same facility as we do. I would suggest that the success that you had as a proficiency student, Gabby, will probably mirror the success of most students at that level, as Steve has said. However, what I thought was particularly interesting was, as I have now seen the recording twice, it seems to me that in fact what we're talking about in terms of prediction skills is actually a way of scaffolding learning. And at lower levels, everything that we can do to help the student get from point A to point Z with individual steps along the way. And then we remove the scaffolding, as we do when we build a house, is actually a really important thing to do. So granted, high levels, prediction may not be so necessary, but at low levels, I think it's absolutely key to giving those students that confidence and that ability to use all of the skills that they need to deal with texts, which in terms of the vocabulary load and also the grammar syntax interface just might otherwise be beyond them. I also think it might be useful, Steve, to pick up later on this point about inferring meaning from context, because I think that's a very questionable one based on the evidence that we have about whether it's actually worth teaching or not, because most students actually, they just don't get it. And most people in L1 don't use it either. So slightly long answer there, but Gabby, based on what Steve and I have both said, can you see perhaps a value for prediction at lower levels?
No, and you see, perhaps I just didn't make myself clear as always, but I can see the value of prediction, and and I never ever skip the prediction tasks when I do a reading or a listening activity with students. I wouldn't just go straight to the text, but perhaps it's just a matter of how you view it, how you actually look at it, because a prediction task is meant to help you develop reading skills. And I really feel that a prediction task is simply a warm-up, and it's something to get students ready for the text. So perhaps this is the difference. So I can see the value in prediction tasks, but perhaps the value I can see, the value I recognize, is of a slightly different character. So I don't really feel that it helps students with reading skills because they probably have it. They just transfer it from L1. So there's no need for us to teach it.
But that's the same
with
for
you about scaffolding. It's very, very important. But for me, it's just a way of starting a reading task, the big task. So don't go straight to the text, but have some kind of a lead-in and some kind of a warm-up.
Can I quote you something, Steve?
Yes.
Back to you, and then I'll come back with a quotation. Steve.
Okay, my only point really is everything we do in an ELT classroom, students can do in L1. everything. So whether it's prediction or any stage of the lesson, they can do that in L1. So what we are doing is highlighting and shining a light on the small things that they do subconsciously in L1 and saying, now you don't think about this in L1. You don't think that you're doing it. You probably don't even know that you're doing it in L1. But let's think about how we apply this thing to learning this new language or to your ability in this new language. And so
but is it not that everything we do in English is what we do in L1? Is it not just related to skills?
Can I come in here?
Yeah.
I don't know if the two of you, this is my new bedtime reading, by the way.
Oh, this is the book I really wanted to get. Oh, sorry, I got overexcited. Neil, you have to tell me if it's any good, because it's the book that I'm planning to buy, but it's very expensive.
And there is a really interesting chapter called Activating and Building Background Knowledge versus Teaching Skimming and Scanning. And one of the points that it makes is that skimming and scanning, which is often tested in exams, is actually typically not the most important skill that readers use in real life, where in fact, the ability to understand the text in detail is really what we need to do. And therefore, if we're having a reading course, we might do a bit of skimming and scanning as a way of getting the students into the text. But if we stop at the end of scanning, we're doing them a disservice, because it doesn't respond to what they really need in reading. It then goes on to make the point that if we use prediction tasks, and by prediction tasks, which it agrees we do in L1, which they then refer to as building on existing knowledge, and then so activating existing knowledge and then developing new background knowledge, that rather, as Steve has said in that lovely example of the lesson that he did in the diploma, this actually does have a definite impact on the ability of the students to compensate for some of the other areas which cause difficulty in reading. And typically that is not having enough words, vocabulary knowledge, but also is to do with their ability to cope with the kind of grammatical syntactical features. In other words, anything that we do consciously to lower the students', let me start that again. If we accept that most students might lack some of the vocabulary and some of the grammatical syntactical skills to actually process the text for meaning, anything that we do, even if we fear that it might be a bit patronizing because they would do it naturally, will actually scaffold and help them to understand the text better. And that's why we read. And I would suggest to you, when I look at my Italian and French, my other languages, I don't actually predict as well as I should. I don't look at the text and say, what do the subheadings do to help me? What do the pictures do to help me? How can the title help me? I tend just to dive straight in. And I think probably if I'm more consciously aware and my level of Italian is operational bilingual, then probably I'd be a more successful reader. And I think actually what we're debating here is two sides of the same coin. In fact, you've said yourself that you do prediction tasks. Maybe it's a matter of not what we call them, but a recognition that they get the students excited about the text. They enable the students to bring to the text things which they can do in their L1, but are they actually doing it in the L2? It's not can they do it, it's do they do it? And that for me is the really important point.
Yeah, and that's what I experienced in the class in this lesson itself, was that students were naturally just throwing themselves into a text. When they were faced with an authentic text at work, they were just throwing themselves into it and not succeeding and losing confidence, and not just losing confidence in processing text, but also losing confidence in English in general, because I thought my English was better than this. Why am I not able to do this? And it had a huge knock-on effect for them. And this needed addressing, and actually giving them a framework to say, okay, so this is something you can do. This is something that you do automatically when you're speaking Arabic or French, but actually this is something that we can do consciously in English. And giving them that framework of prediction made a huge difference. And yeah, and I mean, the results in class were amazing, and the feedback post class when we met the following week was that students had applied it and it worked. And actually, I'm a huge advocate of this, particularly with business students. The thing that I love about business English students is whatever you teach them in class, generally they use it the next day. Whereas general English, there's not always the occasion for them to use it the following day. And so what I like with what I do with business English class is, and I'm completely forgotten where I'm going with this, just make sure that you're giving them something that can be used and is going to make a difference. So this prediction for business meetings, prediction for interview conversations in general, prediction, activating schemata, but actually before you go into that meeting, interview, presentation, sit back and give yourself 10 minutes to jot some notes down about what you think is going to be coming up and the language that's going to be there and the questions you might be asked. And we do this a little bit in L1, but we tend to fly by the seat of our pants in L1. But this is all about preparing for success, really. And prediction for me, taking time to think about what's coming up, is all about preparing for success. Success breeds confidence. Anything that does that, I love. Neil.
On that note of preparing students for success, certainly it was the case for many years that I was guilty as a teacher of listening and reading of providing my students with fantastic texts and really interesting questions that simply tested the students' ability to read and listen. I wasn't engaging with the teaching of subskills. Now, we've had this really interesting discussion so far about the role of prediction as one of the subskills. And I think it's fascinating to see how highly experienced trainers can still find room for debate in all of this. But for people perhaps who are at the start of their teaching journey, can you just explain to us a little bit more about what you mean by teaching subskills for success rather than testing reading and listening skills generally, perhaps using prediction as an example, as that's what we're talking about today? What do we mean by teaching subskills? What are they all about?
I think what tends to happen is we tend to use the listening or reading text as prep for upcoming vocab or grammar, and giving students a bit of context in which to see the upcoming vocab and grammar, and that gets the power of, that gets the hero moment in the lesson, the grammar or the vocab. And actually what I mean by teaching subskills is, rather than go through that lesson plan of gist, question, schemata, gist, question, skimming, scanning, that kind of regular process that we go through with reading or listening, it's better to pull out those individual skills and spend some time focusing on each of those subskills on their own and honing that subskill. It's a bit like the gym, isn't it? You go to the gym and you jump on a piece of equipment and off you go. What a personal trainer will tell you about that piece of equipment is, okay, first of all, we're going to focus on what you're doing with your legs. When we've worked out what you're doing with your legs, we're going to look at how your breathing is. When we've worked out how your breathing is, we're going to look at how you're sitting with your back on that piece of equipment. And it's very much that. It's not just read, it's individual subskills. Not just test them, but actually take time to talk about, what does this mean? How do we do it? How do you do it in L1? You know, I'm very aware of Gabby's point of it being patronizing. And we have to be very open with our students and say, look, you know you know how to do this because you do it every day in L1. But let's focus on it and see how we can make it work for you in English.
I wonder if that's actually true. I mean, there is a clear evidence base for transference from L1 to L2. So people who are good readers will probably be able to transfer their reading skills from L1 into L2. I think there are two things here. Number one, if we think about skimming, we think about gist, and we typically skim a reading text to get the gist. The question is, and for years I haven't have a clue of how to answer this, was, okay, as a teacher, I say, I'd like you to skim the text and then decide, you know, which of the following 3 titles is the best one. And then the student one day said, yeah, but how do I skim? And I was
Exactly. And this is why we have to teach subskills, because although they do it, although we all do it in L1, we don't know that we're doing it. And we don't identify these as separate parts of our reading ability or listening ability.
But I even question that because, again, as language teachers, we're probably fairly competent readers in L1 and in L2. But the question is, a lot of students that I meet, I work a lot with nurses at the moment, and they're training to do a medical English test. And they might not have been particularly good at English at school. They may not have been particularly good in their own L1. A lot of them don't actually read very much. So I actually wonder, if you don't have a particularly good reading skill in L1, part of our jobs to say, well, don't worry, because we'll actually help you to become a good reader in L2.
Yeah.
And they might find that they can transfer that skill back into L1. So if they're working in the NHS and they've got to scan 4 texts to pull out key information to make a decision about how to treat this patient, if they go back into their L1 setting, typically maybe in Kerala in India or in the Philippines, that they're going to be able to actually use those reading skills that we've taught them in the L2 classroom to be more effective and efficient readers, even in their first language.
This is a hugely fair point, and I think 2 things really. First of all, it goes back to my point of know your audience, know your students, your teaching individuals, know what their particular reading habits and skills are like in L1, find that out. But before we try to teach them reading skills in L2. But you know, so much of what we do in the ELT classroom feeds back into their L1 lives and into my L1 life as well, you know. But actually, I have students who've come to me and said, you know, I have a far better understanding of grammar in my own language now because I've learned something about English grammar today. And things, you know, we teach them things like collocations, words that go together. And people don't think about this in L1. And actually I know many students who come to me with saying that they have a newfound passion in their own language, of their L1, because we've ignited something in English and that they've become excited about how language works and how language is structured. So the knock-on effects from anything we teach in the ELT classroom can be huge, yeah.
And I guess that might be even more the case, you know, thinking again about the people watching this discussion today, who perhaps are facing a decision later on in their careers, whether they're going to follow an EFL path or whether they're going to go into ESOL. Because in the ESOL context, a large number of people who perhaps may be semi-literate or indeed can't read and write in their own language. So those assumptions about the subskills and that you can just apply it, for that group of people in the ESOL context, perhaps we need to be particularly sensitive to the need to sensitively introduce them to these skills, because they may well just not have them at all.
And I think in ESOL in particular, one of the challenges of the ESOL teacher is increasing your students' confidence in the language and increasing their willingness to engage with the language. And it all boils down to confidence. So anything that I can do with my students that is going to increase their confidence, and I'm a firm believer that a good prediction lesson actually will increase their confidence because they'll be better at something afterwards. For the ESOL teacher, it's a huge thing, you know. In the UK, I know many ESOL teachers who, as you say, you give a very accurate picture of what their student group might be like.
We've talked a lot about reading so far. So if I can perhaps put both of us slightly, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Put us both kind of in the firing line, as it were. Maybe let's think about prediction and listening.
Sure.
The things that you talked about in terms of prediction activities aren't going to work in quite the same way in listening. Or maybe they can. So what do you think? How can we help students with prediction tasks in a listening environment?
Okay, so generally we don't listen out of context, do we? We know what we're going to listen to. So if I'm going to an international conference and I'm going to have to listen to somebody speaking in German, my German is better than my Spanish, but not, you know, I don't claim any level of fluency, but I could work my way through a presentation if I knew the subject. So what I would do is have a look at the clues that there are. So what's the topic of the conference? So what's this conference all about? And then who is this person who's speaking? What's their area of expertise? What have they spoken about in the past? Titles of books they've written. I can find this quite easily, can't I? And also then think about, how is a presentation structured? So given that this is a 30-minute session, I can expect that the first 10 minutes will be slightly different to the last 10 minutes and the middle 10 minutes will be different to both. So I do have lots of clues there that are going to help me with that listening. Same with a podcast, same with a talking book, same with a radio show. I do have clues that I can use that are going to help me predict what's coming up. But not as easy as reading, for sure.
That's really interesting, because as we started that conversation, I was thinking, oh, this is all really good. I don't know anything like that. And then I suddenly remembered a course that I'd been involved in teaching but not developing, which was an academic English listening skills program for university pre-sessional. And for those people who are joining us who perhaps haven't been involved in academic English tuition so far, academic English is about primarily developing skills, the very thing that we're talking about. And in fact, one of the really interesting aspects of that program was how we used the skill of prediction to enable international students who had never attended a content-based lecture in their lives to navigate successfully that particular lecture. So we would ask them to try, we'd give them the title. There may even have been a short simplified abstract, and they were then asked to predict both some of the content points and some of the key language points, which they then had to go
Fab.
off and,
Yeah.
research. We asked them to look up some journal articles or some course books that were related to the topic and have a look at them. So that, again, immersed them a little bit into the content area. But also things like signposting language. So we've looked at, we're going to move on to look at, which again brings us all the way back to scaffolding, doesn't it? Providing students with a framework within which they can work. And if the framework was prediction, it was key language, key terminology, content, and possibly also key writers in the field.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess a further example of actually that we can scaffold listening, and that was an example of academic listening. We've been banding this word scaffolding backwards and forwards. Maybe it might be useful to just talk a little bit about what do we mean by scaffolding?
Sure.
How does it fit into, and how does prediction fit into a scaffolded reading subskills class and reading generally? What does scaffolding mean to you?
To me, scaffolding at its most basic is lesson planning backwards. Scaffolding is looking at the task that you want your students to achieve and the end task that you want your students to achieve. So for example, in a writing lesson, you know, your end task would be producing a piece of writing. And so from there on, having worked out what my end result is, or my communicative task at the end, whatever that's going to be at the end, I work backwards with my lesson plan. And I think about what am I going to need to put in place in order for the student to be able to do that. So what language input do they need? What schemata activation do they need? And prediction as a big part of schemata activation as well. So actually, rather than starting off with a schemata activation task, I start off with my communicative task or my writing task or my end task for that lesson. And for me, that's scaffolding. So scaffolding is everything that you do that helps a student produce a piece of work, you know, helps them achieve success in a task, which is the target task of the lesson. That to me is scaffolding. How's that for you, Neil? Is that a good description?
I really don't think there's anything more I need to say, because maybe in terms of as an analogy, we could think of a group of students who have gone for a walk in the country, and they find themselves by a river. And on the opposite side of the river is a big box with £1 million in gold coins. And of course, what do the students want? They want the £1 million in gold coins.
Don't we all?
So they get there. Now, getting across this river with no help is going to be quite difficult, because the water is deep and the river is wide. But if there are stepping stones that enable them to go from point to point to point so that they can get to the other side of the river, those stepping stones are, if you like, the teacher interventions that help them with that writing task.
Yeah.
It's not go across the river, it's use these steps to help you across the river. It's not
exactly
write this essay on something you know nothing about. It's here's a video, here's a reading task, here's a listening task, here's some language from the reading and the listening to help you. Now let's look at an example essay to see how it's structured.
Of course, absolutely.
Now use them.
Yeah, and it's really that, isn't it? It's, you know, I have an ELT publisher background as well. And so for those people listening, those teachers listening who are teaching in a context where you're following a course book, which is a lot of teachers, the thing with course books is they are designed really with scaffolding in mind. So often you'll find that the end of the unit or the end of the lesson within the unit is a writing task or a communicative task or a group activity or a production activity generally. And by the time we've got to that point, we've, maybe what you're going to do is give a presentation on food and drink in your country. And by the time we've got to that point, we've talked about the types of food that people like. We've looked at vocab like crunchy and crispy and tasty and salty and savory and sweet. And we've looked at all of ways of describing food, and we've looked at ways of cooking food and the vocab for that. And we've listened to people talking about food that they're passionate about. And we've read about successful restaurants and how they were successful. And we've had some language input in terms of grammar as well. And so by the time we get to talking about food and drink from my country, the course book has led you by the nose through that scaffolded lesson. So scaffolding is there. I mean, it is something that is very, very much present, but we have to remember to use it.
And I guess also perhaps we could just add to that the point about the skills development for the student.
Yes.
When they've given that presentation on food from their country, in the development, we've also looked at how to hook people's interest at the beginning of a presentation, how to move people on from section to section, how to bring things to a close, that they can then give an oral presentation on a different subject, but still have the stepping stones in place. They've learnt the skills that enable them to become independent. And I guess that's what scaffolding's final aim is, much as using prediction in a reading class, is about enabling the student to independently be competent in the bigger skill of reading or giving a presentation by building up their knowledge base. I don't like the word knowledge, their skills base, their competencies. They can bring them all together.
And one thing, one thing I'm a huge fan of in the classroom is telling students why we're doing the things that we're doing, why we've done something this way, and getting them to reflect on why we've done things in certain ways as well. So in a nicely scaffolded lesson, I would get them to identify that one of the reasons that they were engaged with that writing task and they felt comfortable and confident about it was because we'd been through stages before. And then we'll talk about not just why did that work, but then real life. How do we apply that to real life? So next time we have to write in real life, we've learned in this lesson that just jumping into writing isn't good, and actually preparing for writing is good. So in real life, can we do that? How can we prepare for writing in real life? If you've got to write a report for your boss, how can you prepare to be more confident and successful when you do that? And encouraging that kind of conversation and debate about not just transferring the language, but transferring the process into real life is really important, I think.
Because most people, when they come to language schools in the UK, at least, and I think probably around the world, very often have quite instrumental motivation. They're not learning English for the sheer love of the subject. No. They're learning English to get a better job, to get a promotion, to earn more money, to be able to do something that their boss has just said, right, you need to go and do this next week. Well, probably a bit too short notice at that point, but you get the idea. Well, my boss wants me to present the company to a new potential buyer. Never presented in English before. Oh gosh! So it's all about kind of enabling people, not just in terms of what they do in the classroom, but as you say, that all-important transference back into their real world situation and going, that's why that's useful.
Yeah. And so this goes back really to Gabby's point of, is prediction a useful thing to teach? And really, my initial answer to that was we're preparing people for success. And I think what we've seen as we're talking is actually how a lot of what we do really is all about preparing students for success when they're using English in a real life context and out of the classroom context. And I would argue strongly that prediction is a huge part of that. And actually the skill, having prediction pointed out explicitly as this is something that you can do, let's practice, I think is really useful in so many real life contexts that I know I've got a difficult task coming up, 5 minutes, let's think about it before we do it. And it's just a life lesson that's wonderful, really, not just in L2, L3, L4, but also in L1.
And I think it's been a really helpful reminder to me when I now next pick up an Italian newspaper or Italian novel, just to sit back a bit and think, okay, this is a skill that we can use in any of our L2s. This is a skill for the ESOL student that they can also transfer back to the L1. And okay, we're mindful that it's probably more useful for students at lower levels because they don't have that vocabulary, they don't have that grammar, syntax knowledge to deal with authentic texts.
Sure.
The way that those C1 students you talked about do have. But regardless, it reduces cognitive load. It makes the job easier. It makes the job less frightening. The affective factors don't kick in and you don't just walk away thinking, I can't read in English, don't want to do that. Yeah. Block. And as you say, it sets people up for success. And what better rationale for any activity can there be than that?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I've really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Can I just add something before you go?
Sure.
It's what was it? Okay. So I was just listening to you, thinking that, you know, I think that my problem with prediction activities is probably because I have a problem with the top-down approach to teaching receptive skills. Okay. I just feel so fed up with the fact that in EFL for many years, the main focus was on the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach was totally left out. And I just, at some point, and perhaps the fact that I'm not so keen on prediction tasks is somehow linked to this. What do you think, Neil? Could it be the reason why I may not see the full value of prediction activities? Because you see, in particular with listening, okay, I mean, to be honest, I have a problem with teaching reading skills, okay? But this may be because of my, again, personal experience. I never wanted to be taught reading skills. I never felt like I needed it in the EFL classroom. And in terms of listening skills, all I wanted was the bottom-up approach, okay? Which teachers never, ever kind of practiced. So all my teachers in the past were always kind of taking this top-down approach, and I found it very automatic, mechanical, and just pointless. And all I needed was the bottom-up approach. And maybe this is the reason why I'm just not big on prediction tasks.
Two things here. Number one, I think it's really interesting that you identify that this may come from your own background, beliefs and values. And I think we all know that one of the dangers in our teaching is to recognize that what we like and what we don't like won't necessarily be what our students like and don't like. So even if we as teachers have a natural suspicion of, or even sometimes an aversion to something, it might well be worth offering it up in the class anyway. But Steve, I don't know if you can help here. I'm not sure if I've got the right link, but Amos Paran back in the 1990s introduced his, was it the interactive compensatory model? Yes. And that model was meant to combine both top-down and bottom-up processes.
Yeah.
Do you remember the name, not the name of the paper, but do you remember much more? Because I haven't looked at this thing since my tip in the late 90s. I'm just trying to find a link.
Interactive processing as opposed to top-down or bottom-up processing. It really is just mixing both, isn't it? So it is about activating schemata, but also knowing the structure of the language and combining both. And actually, I think what Perrin discovered, or what he put forward, was that neither one nor the other can be used in isolation. So there's no point in teaching just top down, and there's no point in teaching just bottom up, because naturally as humans, we use both. And so forcing students down one path or the other actually didn't lead to as much success as students who were using a more integrated approach. I think that's where he was heading, is it not, Neil?
I think that was, I mean, it's such a long time, but I don't know if that helps, Gabby, that both Steve and I are thinking that if you look around the work of Perrin in the late 90s on this interactive compensatory model, you're going to see a rationale for doing a bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying don't do any of the top-down approach activities or tasks. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that perhaps the focus should be shifted to the bottom-up process rather than.
I would say it's really shifting the focus in. If you take a middle point of 50-50, shifting the focus in either direction is, for me, not so much about what I prefer as a teacher, but what I think is going to work best with the group of students sat in front of me. Moving away from that half top down, half bottom up to more bottom up or more top down, really for me is a question of not really personal taste, but what's going to work with these guys. Yeah.
And I'd add to my journey during lockdown, and I have to say it's actually thanks to gallery teachers that this really got kickstarted, and it was Andre Headland, and everything he was talking about, neuroscience, visible learning, visible thinking, and now increasingly evidence-based learning, that there is a fascinating chapter in here about exactly what we've been talking about this afternoon. And, I think I couldn't recommend enough getting a hold of a copy of this and reading that chapter, because it looks at a clear evidence base and meta-analyses for arguing that, when it comes to helping students to read better, that skimming and scanning are only useful if we're teaching students to skim and scan. If we're teaching them to read, we really need to be thinking about increasing the vocabulary. We need to be thinking about helping them with the grammatical syntactical interface. And we need to be giving them skills that enable them to work with existing background knowledge and build new background knowledge to help. So, as you've said, Gabby, I mean, this is changing a lot about what I think, and eventually it'll change what I do.
I love that they chose the classic top-down processing image for the front cover, which is just hilarious. That that's the image that we see all the time when we talk about top-down processing, isn't it?
The little bunny rabbit going, oh!
Yeah, the eagle-eye view of the document. Yeah.
Fab. Hopefully that conversation has given you something to play with in terms of the audience, and the audience. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? About, we do these events and sometimes we think, oh, we had 100 people, great. Or, oh, we only had a few people, that's not so good. But what we never really think about is the value of what people do when they watch this later on.